Good evening, it's Mr. Evans, and tonight we are finishing up our book Dollar for Luck by Elizabeth Coatsworth. We are starting with chapter 14. That's funny. Didn't you feel the ice move? Emily asked in a low whisper. It just goes up and down with the tide, Ken whispered back, pulling in one of his lines. This didn't feel like that. I'll go and look. But just then there was a tug on another of his lines, and Ken forgot what he was going to do. About that time, Emily had a rush of smelts, the largest she had had that morning. She, too, caught the fishing fever and forgot everything else. If there were noises around them, the children inside the little shanty didn't hear them. Their pail was filling fast with small, slim fish, drawn up through the strange little window in the ice, with the cold wonder of the sea still on their shining scales. It must have been half an hour later, when the run had paused again, that Emily joggled Ken's elbow and whispered, "It seems to be moving sideways." "What?" "Whisper louder." "It seems to be moving sideways." "What's moving sideways?" "The ice." "Oh!" This time Ken got up, stiff from sitting so long on half a chair, and went rather casually towards the canvas door of the shanty, stopping first to put another small stick or two into the old stove. "There, feel that?" Emily asked, rather nervously this time and forgetting to whisper. This time Ken did notice a jar all through the ice under their feet, and with it went a loud groan. He lost his casualness and put his shoulder to the door so hastily that he felt the canvas rip. Then it opened under his hand, and he stood outside with Emily crowding after him. The air felt cold after the heat inside, but the sun almost blinded them, used as they were to shadow. For half a minute they couldn't see what had happened. Then Emily wailed, "We're adrift!" A crack had appeared between them and the shore, and this crack had widened until it was 3 or 4 feet from ice to ice. Ken pulled Emily forward. "Could you jump that if you ran? I'd go over first and catch hold of your hands." "Oh, I couldn't," sobbed Emily, and even as she spoke, the crack widened by another foot, and Ken knew that neither of them could jump it now. If only he had paid attention to Emily when she first spoke. A board might still do, but there was no board. He began hauling desperately at the shanty stovepipe. "Pull it over for a bridge. The canvas will hold us," he shouted, but again he was too late. By the time they had disconnected the pipe and lifted the shanty over the stove and hauled it to the crack, the blue-black water, pouring seaward, was too wide to be bridged, even by the frail bridge of canvas. Emily was crying, but Ken began to shout, "Dale! Dale Fraser! Help! Help!" Where the Frasers were, much nearer the shore, the ice had not yet cracked, and there was no sign that the two had become alarmed. But at Ken's cries, the door opened, and the man and boy stumbled out and stood, shading their eyes against the sun. "What's the matter?" Big Dale shouted. "We're adrift," Ken shouted back. "Adrift." Without another word, the clam digger began to run heavily in his big worn-out boots towards them, with his boy after him. When he got to the edge of the ice, he stopped to look things over, with young Dale at his shoulder. "Know anyone got a boat round here? Tide's going out." Even as he spoke, the big floe on which the children stood was moving downriver. Sometime during the last hour or so, the ice had given way, and now the part that felt the force was breaking off in larger or smaller pieces and floating down with the river. Their floe was about half the size of a barn floor. It tilted and turned a very little as it moved, but it was steady enough. Ken gave a quick look at the river bank with its woods and cleared fields. A little down the road he could see Cy Holbrook's house, but Cy was old. He wouldn't be likely to have a boat in commission. And beyond him lived the 2 Daly sisters. No help there. Gosh, no. Maybe Sam Hanks, but he's 3 miles down. After the first moment of fright, Emily had stopped sobbing. Shall we swim? She asked fearfully. No, you sit tight. We'll find something. Flo may drift in. He and young Dale were walking along to keep pace with the children's flow, but it didn't drift in. It was drifting out. The man made a decision. Tear off that there door and see if you can't steer a mite toward the point. We'll try to meet you there. And, followed by young Dale, he started running again back toward their shanty. When Ken got to their own smelt house, lying on its side where they had left it, Emily was already trying to wrench the canvas door from the frame. Together they managed it, and together they held the awkward oblong in the river, trying to steady it between their bodies. It was very hard to do. Time and again, the end they held almost swept them into the swift water, as they felt the force of some strong eddy. The great awkward flow seemed almost uninfluenced by the frail rudder they were trying to use. It's no good, Ken panted at last, but Emily was more patient. At least we're doing something, she said. And look, Ken, we're not going out as far as a lot of the ice. A piece just passed us a moment ago. My hands are getting numb. Maybe I can hold on alone. The stove's still going. All alone on the ice, with the chair beside it, the stove stood, its stovepipe askew, with the smoke still coming out of it and a little pile of unburned wood in the basket beside it. At any other time, Ken would have laughed, but, especially with Emily along, this being carried out on a floe was no laughing matter. He wouldn't leave the rudder, of course. With his weight gone, next thing they'd know, Emily'd be in the river. He looked landward, and there were the Frasers on shore, chopping down a young tree. Well, they must have some reason for it. He hoped they had time enough, that was all. They seemed so slow he couldn't bear to watch them, and looked away. If he'd been in a boat, he'd say the river certainly looked fine, such blue water with ice like big flat suds streaming out on it. Just then another floe struck them, knocking off a piece of each of the ice rafts, and grinding along beside them for a little way. They're running along shore now, reported Emily. Ken looked across to the still unbroken ice, along which, near the bank, he could see two rather small figures running, carrying a pole between them. Awkward as they looked, they were gaining a little on the floe. While he watched, they came abreast the children, and then forged a little ahead. He hadn't thought they were such good runners. They're going to get to the point before us, said Emily. Push hard, Ken. See if we can't make this old floe point inshore. But push as they could and push as they would on the door, the cake seemed to take very nearly its own course, majestically sailing down the river. The Frasers had reached the point, cutting across the ice to its very tip. Goodness, Emily said with sudden shrillness, they're on a cake of ice too. But the Frasers knew what they were doing. They had jumped on a small pan which they were poling towards the children. The water was shallow here. At low tide these would be flats. Big Dale had the pole and was working frantically. At last he thrust it into his son's hands, wiping his arm across his forehead. The two floes were getting nearer. Emily and Ken could see the men's faces now, and even hear them panting. But the water was getting deeper, and the pan of ice moved more slowly now, as the poling grew more difficult. In spite of the now desperate efforts of the children to swing their floe inshore, or to delay it, they could see that they were in danger of sweeping past the Frasers. Nothing they could do seemed to help. With a curse, Big Dale snatched the pole out of his son's hands, and, running to the very edge of his floe until it tilted sharply with his weight, he held the stick toward the children. Let go, Ken shouted to Emily, and both children jumped clear of the door and ran towards the pole. But it was just beyond their reach. Ken's fingers brushed it, but he could get no hold. The flow, still in the current, swept past and out of reach. Emily gave a shrill cry. But Youngdale was kneeling on the very edge of the ice now and had picked up a piece of board such as the fishermen, when fishing in the shanties, often put in front of their chairs to keep their feet off the ice. He was paddling, with every stroke dipping one mittened hand into the water. On the other side, Big Dale was poling, only now and then hitting bottom, but grimly doing what he could. The space between the ice floes lessened, and suddenly with a jar the two came together. While young Dale continued his heavy paddling, his father came forward with the pole, and Ken and Emily grabbed the other end. It seemed like heaven itself to feel the hard wood in their hands. "What do you think, Pa? Try the big one?" "Couldn't move it with that board. Kids had better come aboard this one." "Hold them?" "Might." The man looked at the children. "Girl first. Hop," he ordered. Emily. Emily hopped, and the pan jarred under her weight, sending out a splash of water. Then Ken jumped, holding onto the pole until the last minute. They were all four on the small ice cake now, and the water looked very near. But Youngdale, his face streaming with sweat, was paddling again. He had scarcely given them a grin, but now he said, "One of you wipe my forehead. Can't see." And Emily, who was nearest, took the corner of her scarf and kept the sweat from running into his eyes. Pretty soon Big Dale began to pull again, and after that they moved faster. They were being carried below the point, but all the time the water was shallowing and the tilting crazy little boat of ice was moving in towards the shore. And just before it touched solid ice, there was a shout from the road above them. Mr. Philbrook, in the sleigh, had arrived in time to see the end of the adventure. Somehow, before they reached shore, Mr. Philbrook had arrived. He helped Emily and Ken onto the solid ice without a word. It was to Dale Fraser that he spoke. "I'm afraid the children have given you a lot of trouble," he said, shaking hands with the older man, and then with young Dale. Old Dale said, "Couldn't let them go out to sea." Young Dale just grinned while he pulled off his wet mittens and began beating his hands across his chest. "You're wet," Mr. Philbrook said quickly. "Won't you drive home in the cutter with us?" Old Dale shook his head. Young Dale said, "We got the stove going in the shanty. We'll dry out easy." Without another word, the two turned to trudge back to where the rest of the Smelt village still stood on the big shelf of solid ice. Emily ran after them, and they stopped rather unwillingly while she thanked them. Ken, too, shook hands and stumbled over his words. He was a little bewildered by realizing how much he owed to the Frasers. "Be home this evening, Mr. Philbrook?" called to Old Dale. "Something I'd like to talk over with you." The man gave a grunt of assent and this time walked off without turning his head again, though young Dale gave a quick half-wave of a hand before following him. "Guess you didn't listen very hard," Mr. Philbrook remarked to the children as they climbed the slope toward the road. "There's always a lot of cracking before ice breaks off." "We were fishing," Ken said. "Yes," Mr. Philbrook assented. "I know how it is. I oughtn't to have let you go in the first place." Dad's pretty calm about it all, Ken thought, until he reached the sleigh. There stood Major, the livery sorrel, his plush winter coat matted with sweat and his sides still heaving. Emily, who hadn't spoken before, looked at the horse and slipped her hand into Mr. Philbrook's. "You must have seen us quite a ways down the road," she said, and then added shyly, "Dad." With an air of surprise, Mr. Philbrook stroked his long mustache, looked at Major, and remarked, "That horse must have been running." Then the three climbed into the sleigh. Dad had plenty of feelings, the children could see now. He just didn't think there was any use in talking about them. But as they drove along slowly so that Major could get his wind, he asked all about what had happened before he came on the scene, and Emily and Ken told him from the very beginning. "I thought there wasn't much use hollering to the Frasers, Dad," Ken explained. "I remembered what you'd always said about how that kind is yellow." "I was mistaken," Mr. Philbrook admitted. "It teaches me not to sit in judgment." That evening after supper, Mr. Philbrook lighted his lantern and went off to Mr. Young's fish house to have a talk with the Frasers. He was gone for 2 hours or more, and the family went to bed before he got back, leaving the lamp turned low on the kitchen table. Next morning he remarked at breakfast, "I'm going to keep the new sloop. I've arranged with Dale Fraser to let him and young Dale take it out. We're going to go shares on the profits." There was a stunned silence, and then Ralph exclaimed, "Keep it and go into partnership with anyone you like, Dad, except the Frasers. They'll ruin her inside a month. It's like giving the cat a silver dish to drink milk out of." Mr. Philbrook nodded. "Maybe you're right and maybe you're wrong, Ralph, but I've made the arrangement. I thought I had the Frasers all pigeonholed my own self, and I was wrong. Ma's always held they'd be all right if they could get back their self-respect. And if anything could give a fisherman his self-respect, it'd be to go out into a sloop like this last one." Ralph put his face in his hands. "Scroll work and all," he groaned. "She was the first of the type," said Stuart. "We'll never build another quite so good." Ma Philbrook spoke up from her end of the table. "Then it's right and proper she should be used for a good purpose. If Dad goes halves with them, maybe he'll do better in the long run than selling outright. Ty Andrews used to send out half the boats he built on that arrangement, and it worked out good. Anyway, people are more important than things. If the Frasers can be helped back, a sloop couldn't be put to a better use, and there's no reason why Dad shouldn't do very well by her too." "You're right, Ma. It's just our sinful pride," said Stuart with a short laugh. "Come on, Ralph, let's do the thing up brown. I've got an outfit I could let one of them have, and you've got another. If they're going to go out in our new sloop, they've got to look halfways decent when they're on her." How strange everything was. Ken had felt sure that there would be a third meeting with the Frasers, but he had never guessed how different it would be from the others. And he was glad he hadn't told anyone his suspicions about the men on Star Island. Now they would have their chance to be like other people. If they did well, and why mightn't they, with a vessel like that, they'd have, after a while, money to buy or build a regular house, and get clothes of their own and the things they needed. It was a fresh start, and he and Emily both knew what a fresh start felt like. Perhaps the Frasers wouldn't do well. There's always a chance they'd skip off sometime and sell the sloop and not come back. That was the risk Dad took, just as old Dale and young Dale had taken a risk on that ice cake. But Dad wasn't afraid of a risk. Ken was proud to have had a share, even a small one, in building the new sloop, and Emily must have felt the same way, for she looked across the table at him, her pretty two-colored eyes very serious, and said in a low voice, "I helped put on the gold leaf." Just then Mother Philbrook went to the stove and came back with the coffee pot. "Another cup all around," she said cheerfully, "and let's wish the Frasers happiness and success." And that is the end of our story. I will be back again tomorrow night with a different book for us. Have a wonderful evening.